My name is Ruth Ann Lee. I am 28 years old, a quiet woman who has always preferred sketchbooks to smartphones, humble street cafes to grand hotels. Some people say that I carry an old soul within me, even though I was born in the fast-rushing heart of New York City. Perhaps it is true. I have never been dazzled by wealth, nor by the blending lights of high society, the kind that takes photographs with champagne glasses and leaves little room for sincerity. I work really hard to make videos for you all, so please subscribe to my channel and like this video. Also, make sure to tell me your name and where you are watching this story from. Let's start the story. But I must confess something to you, dear listener. This story is not only mine to tell, it is also mine to live. And it is about love. Yes, love in its purest and most painful form. Love that asks whether we must sacrifice who we are to keep it alive, or whether we must let it go to preserve our dignity. Once upon a time, I believed love was enough. I no longer know if that is true. I was raised by a single mother in a neighborhood where brownstones leaned close as though sharing secrets and where children drew constellations with chalk on cracked sidewalks. My mother, Doris, was a librarian who lived on peanut butter sandwiches and library dust, yet she taught me to read both books and human souls. She told me, "Ruth Ann, you don't need riches to matter. You need courage to stand as you are." It was from her that I inherited the confidence to be an artist, though my paintings never hung in prestigious galleries. Instead, they adorned the walls of cafes, small exhibitions, or the hands of locals who bought them because they felt something. Art, for me, was like breathing. It was also humbling, for no one really applauded when you poured out your soul at a street market. And yet, that is where I met Edward Caldwell. Edward was everything and nothing I expected. A tall man with sandy blonde hair swept back effortlessly, strolled into the cafe on 6th Avenue one early winter evening. He didn't look like someone who belonged in such a modest place. His coat alone probably cost more than my entire month's rent. But instead of brushing past my small exhibit by the corner window, he stopped. He studied my canvas of a woman wading barefoot by a riverbank. I still remember how long he stood there, unmoving, before finally turning to me and saying, "She looks lonely, but her loneliness is dignified." I was startled. Few people ever looked beyond the colors. Most buyers complimented tones, brushstrokes, or whether the painting matched their living room walls. But Edward saw her. He saw the emotion. That day, we spoke for over an hour about art, about the way time carves us invisibly, about the music of silence. It was as though someone had peeled back my world and stepped into it with grace. We met again. He kept coming back, to my small corner in the cafe, to my world of paints and turpentine. Soon he confessed that he was the son of a wealthy family, one of those old American families whose last names decorated hospital wings and university libraries. I understood then why he walked so comfortably in tailored coats, but what struck me was that he never made me feel small. With Edward, I wasn't the struggling artist, I was Ruth Ann. He told me that my art gave him breath in a world of suffocating rituals. And so, against every odd whisper in my head, I fell in love. The winter deepened, and by spring, Edward asked me to marry him. We had been together nearly a year. He asked not with extravagant diamonds or in a ballroom, but one evening by the Hudson River, where the sunset bled into orange fire. He knelt quietly, his eyes unsure for the first time since I met him, and said, "I don't need the world, Ruth Ann. I just need you." And I said yes. Perhaps I was naive, or perhaps I chose to believe love could leap class, history, and expectation. I wore his ring, though it was far simpler than the pieces his family women flaunted in magazines. But soon, reality came knocking. At first, I didn't notice his hesitations. He would make excuses when I asked about meeting his family. They're always busy. It's complicated. Or he would insist that introductions could wait until later. But then when his friends from Yale or associates from his investment firm would gather, he never once invited me. Once, I found out by accident. A mutual acquaintance told me Edward had attended a gala at the Metropolitan Museum, his arm linked with his cousin instead of me. When I confronted him, he brushed it off, saying, "That world isn't for you, Ruth Ann. I don't want you hurt by their judgments." His words stung. Wasn't his world also mine now? Yet I loved him, and so I swallowed the hurt. But wounds don't stay silent. They fester. One evening, he finally decided we should meet his parents. They insisted, he said, so calmly, as though I should be grateful. The dinner was at their estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, an estate so vast it felt like another universe altogether. Marble floors, chandeliers that glittered like frozen fire, staff moving with precision, and then there were his parents. His mother, swept up in pearls that dripped like icicles, his father, stern with eyes coldly measuring me. Dinner was an unspoken war. Every polite question concealed a dagger. "Where did you study art, Ruth Ann?" "Oh, community college. How quaint. And your mother?" "A librarian. Admirable, in a way." Through it all, Edward sat silent, shifting in discomfort, but never once shielding me, never once saying, "This is the woman I love." That night, as we drove back to the city, I stared at the passing lights. The reflection of myself in the window curved like some half-forgotten stranger. Edward placed his hand on mine, but it felt heavy, heavy like the silence between us. Days later, it came to me. The realization, vast and merciless. Edward loved me in private, but not in public. I was his solace, his shelter, but not his pride. He hid me from the world because somehow, to him, I still didn't fit. And that is how the question lodged itself in my chest, sharp as glass. Should I fight and prove myself worthy of his world? Or should I walk away, dignified, unbroken? This, dear listener, is the story I now unfold, the story of how a woman must decide whether love is worth surrendering herself for, or whether true love can only survive when met with courage and equality. Because sometimes choosing dignity is also choosing to keep one's heart alive. I thought after that dinner, Edward would have realized the weight of his silence. I thought perhaps he would redeem himself, stand by me, show me the courage I needed to see in the man I loved. But instead, the days that followed grew quieter between us, as though his silence had learned to stretch and build walls. Edward's world was one of galas, polo tournaments, charity auctions, and glittering brunches at rooftop clubs with chandeliers made of real crystal. He received endless invitations, thick with expensive gold-lettered embossing. I knew this because they lay scattered on his kitchen counter, among the neatly stacked mail that his housekeeper arranged. Each time he would tell me, "It's nothing, Ruth Ann, just obligations." Each time, he went alone. It was as if there were two Edwards, the man who traced the paint stains on my fingers with affection, and the polished son who slipped into tuxedos and danced in circles without me. It unsettled me, not because I wanted entry into that world for its wealth, but because I wanted us seen. Love, when genuine, should not live only in shadows. Around this time, my mother, Doris, took note of my unease. One morning, while sipping her eternal cup of black coffee, she said, "You've dimmed, Ruth Ann. When you loved your art, you shone. Now you speak more of restraint than of expression." I tried to argue, but her words clung to me. My mother had never been wealthy, but her love was rich. It draped me in safety, and I couldn't ignore when she voiced concern. She asked me, quietly, "Does he hide you, child?" I had no answer, and my silence itself became an answer. It was in the midst of this quiet war within myself that opportunity came knocking. A small gallery downtown, run by a curator named Helen Marquez, took interest in my collection. Helen wanted to host a proper exhibition, my first real gallery show. It was to be called Dignities in Shadows. The title itself felt hauntingly personal, as though my canvases were confessing on my behalf. They held images of women gazing defiantly at worlds that did not want them, women standing barefoot on marble floors, women walking beneath chandeliers with no jewels on their necks. When I told Edward about the gallery event, his smile was genuine. For a moment. But then he said too carefully, "That's wonderful, Ruth Ann, but I don't think you should expect my parents to attend. That crowd isn't, well, it isn't exactly the sort they mingle with." Something inside me cracked. I didn't say it out loud, but I thought, is that your polite way of saying you'd rather not attend either? On the night of my gallery opening, the air smelled of varnish and fresh bread from the bakery next door. The walls were spotless white, my canvases glowing beneath thoughtful spotlights. People came, friends, students, locals who felt emotion in oil and acrylic strokes. It should have been my proudest moment. Edward did show up, but hours late, in a perfectly pressed suit, after mingling at a cocktail fundraiser uptown. He breezed in, kissed my cheek, and told me how proud he was. Yet when others asked him what he thought of my art, he smiled politely, without truly answering. He wasn't present with me. He was simply there, a guest in my own moment. Helen whispered to me after he left early, "He doesn't see that you'll outgrow him." I dismissed it, but her words gnawed at me like unseen moths. Not long after, the moment that would test me arrived. Edward received an invitation to the highly exclusive Caldwell Foundation Spring Gala. This was his family's event, one that gathered not only high society, but also powerful figures from across the states. To my shock, he didn't immediately hide it from me. Instead, he looked at me uneasily and said, "They don't want complications, Ruth Ann. If you came, it would invite whispers. I would rather keep us separate from that chaos." Separate. The word lashed through me harder than I expected. I asked him, softly but firmly, "Am I only enough for you in private, Edward?" He couldn't look at me. His silence was enough. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked my apartment barefooted, past canvases leaning like tired witnesses against walls. Finally, I pulled out a blank canvas. One long brush stroke after another, I painted until dawn. What emerged was neither graceful nor beautiful. It was raw, a woman bending beneath the weight of a crown she never asked to wear, yet refusing to break. As the morning broke across my small apartment, I whispered to myself, I must decide. But decisions don't arrive in one glorious light. They arrive slowly, shaped by quiet moments. A week later, I attended a small art lecture at a university. Afterward, as I was leaving, an older woman approached me. She had sharp eyes, softened by age, and spoke with unusual directness. "Your talk today, it reminded me of my own mistakes." Her name was Miriam, a retired professor. She told me she had once also loved a man who belonged to a world that constantly demanded she shrink herself. "You don't realize at first," she said, "how costly it is to stay hidden. But little by little, Ruth Ann, you fade into a shadow in your own life. And love that insists on silence, it isn't love at all. It's fear disguised in affection." The words struck something deep. They stayed with me, humming like background music I couldn't turn off. When the night of the grand Caldwell Spring Gala finally arrived, I wasn't invited, but I made a choice. I dressed simply in a navy dress I had once worn at a friend's wedding, and I went anyway. Not inside, but as close as the gates would allow. Limousines glided in, gowns sparkled like living constellations. Laughter and crystal glass clinks floated into the garden air. I stood outside, anonymous, one woman outside the walls of a glittering world. And then I saw him, Edward, stepping out in black tie, his face calm, polished, belonging entirely to their world. He looked both magnificent and heartbreakingly distant. For a moment, I imagined myself at his side. I imagined the whispers, the measuring glances, the subtle dismissals. I imagined how small I would be asked to make myself just to survive in that ballroom. And once more, I remembered Miriam's words, and my mother's words, and the silence of that dinner table in Greenwich. Something inside me shifted permanently. I turned and walked away before Edward could see me. My heart was heavy, but clear. Love had brought me to this crossroads, but dignity would lead me out. Perhaps I would tell him tomorrow, perhaps the next week. But the decision was already made in that moment. The decision that sometimes walking away is not defeat. It is the highest form of self-respect. And so, with steady steps beneath the dark Manhattan sky, I began to gather the courage I would need for the farewell that was soon to come. "Edward," I began, "why was I not there last night?" His eyes flinched. He rubbed the back of his neck, buying time. "You know why. It would have been complicated. People would have whispered. My family—" "I am not your family's decision to make," I interrupted, my voice firmer than I had imagined. "I am the woman you asked to marry me, and yet you cannot stand beside me in the light." He moved closer, trying for calm. "It's not like that, Ruth Ann. I love you. I want a life with you. But they will never accept it. I only want to protect you." The words I had once taken as affection now felt poisoned. I shook my head slowly. "Protect me? No, Edward. You are protecting yourself from judgment, from whispers, from the truth of loving someone who doesn't belong to their circle. And in trying to protect yourself, you make me your secret." His face hardened. "You don't understand what it means to be part of this world, the expectations, the scrutiny." "I understand more than you think," I said sharply. "I understand that I will never be enough for you, as long as you believe I must change just to walk beside you." Silence stretched between us, taut as a violin string about to snap. Finally, I whispered the words I had replayed all night. "Edward, I cannot marry a man ashamed to love me in the daylight." His eyes darkened, but he did not fight me. He merely stood there, hands limp at his sides, as though unwilling or unable to chase me. I walked out, carrying only myself, and though tears blurred the world, my steps felt lighter than they had in months. The days after were both liberation and mourning. Freedom arrived like a cold wind, sharp but cleansing. Yet I missed him, the warmth of his gaze, the threads of our conversations, the way he traced my paint-stained fingers. Grief is peculiar. It doesn't come only with endings. It comes with imagining what endings erase. But even in those hollow days, the truth remained solid. I could not twist myself small enough to fit into a suit of expectations that had never been made for me. Weeks later, as I was preparing canvases for Helen's next gallery proposal, there was a knock at my apartment door. When I opened it, Edward stood there. He had lost weight, his features more carved by strain than before. In his hands, he carried one of my paintings, the very first one he had ever bought from me, the barefoot woman by the riverbank. He said softly, "I thought you should have this back. She looks lonelier in my house than she does in yours." I took it wordlessly, and for a long moment, we simply stood there, separated by ghosts of what we once had. Finally, he confessed, "I can't change them, Ruth Ann. I wish I were stronger, but I'm not. And I don't deserve you if I can't carry you into that world without shame." His honesty startled me. His weakness was laid bare, and for the first time, I no longer wanted to fix him or us. I only wanted to bless him and let him go. So, I said quietly, "You loved me in your way, but love that hides cannot last. Goodbye, Edward." He nodded once, his eyes damp, before turning and vanishing into the corridor. Days blurred into weeks, and the grief softened into something gentler. My art became my healer. I painted women no longer wading barefoot, but walking away, strong, lifted, fierce. Helen noticed the power in these new works, and soon enough, my second exhibition was scheduled. The title she chose was Unveiled. At the opening night, I stood before my canvas of the crowned woman, now finished. She no longer bent under its weight. Instead, she tossed it aside into the sea, her hair flying free. Audiences stopped, stared, whispered, some even wept. That night, for the first time in years, I felt almost whole. Among the crowd was a journalist, a woman named Alicia, who approached me with a smile that reminded me of the younger version of myself, earnest, curious, believing in the fire of art. She asked if she could interview me for Cultural Magazine. We sat in a cafe days later, and as she asked about my story, I told her everything. Not about Edward by name, but about love, class, and the courage it takes to choose dignity over submission. The interview published under the headline, "Painter of Dignity, the Woman Who Wouldn't Shrink." I never expected the response. Strangers began writing to me, women who had walked away from men who silenced them, women who had chosen dignity over comfort. My story had become theirs too. Months later, Helen told me she had seen Edward at another gala. He was accompanied by a young woman from his family's circle, perfect on his arm, the kind who would never draw paint across her hands. I felt not betrayed, not angry, only distant compassion. Edward was still a prisoner, bound to a world that he believed he could never defy. He would never be free, not as I had learned to be. And perhaps that was the mercy of it. I was no longer chained to him, either by longing or regret. One evening, as I painted near the open window, the city humming outside, I realized something profound. Love isn't only about finding someone who stays. It's about finding someone who frees you to be your fullest self. Sometimes that person walks with you forever. Sometimes their only role is to teach you when to walk away. Edward had been my lesson. Painful, necessary, invaluable. My life stretched ahead of me now, not in marble estates or glittering ballrooms, but in canvases, in truth, in nights filled with color instead of silence. And I, Ruth Ann Lee, had chosen dignity. In the months that followed my farewell to Edward, I learned something I had never understood before. Endings are not merely loss. They are thresholds. And though I feared stepping into what was beyond, I discovered that freedom carries a sweetness of its own. After my story spread through Alicia's article, I began to receive letters. Some were written on scraps of notebook paper, some on pressed stationery with careful handwriting. They came from women in Ohio farmhouses, from students in Los Angeles dorm rooms, from single mothers in Midwestern towns. One letter I still keep in a drawer of my studio. It read, "When my wealthy fiancé told me I wasn't good enough for his parents, I believed him. I stayed, tried to prove myself for years, and lost my joy. Your story reminded me of the girl I once was. Yesterday, I ended it. Yesterday, I found her again." Reading those words, I cried. not for myself, but for the chorus of hidden women who had always been told to shrink. Somehow, my personal pain had rippled outward and become a beacon for others. Helen, my curator, asked me one afternoon, "Ruth Ann, would you consider teaching? You have more to give than just your art. You have a story that can ignite others." The idea frightened me at first. Teaching required standing in front of others, unveiling myself, more vulnerability, but I accepted. At a small community arts center in Brooklyn, I began hosting weekly classes. My students came from all walks of life: retired nurses, teenagers with restless hands, construction workers, baristas, young mothers with babies sleeping against their chests. I taught them not only how to mix color or stretch a canvas, but how to pour their fiercest truths onto paper. I told them, art is not about being accepted. It is about refusing to silence what is inside you. And as I saw their faces light up, I realized I was doing with them what I could never do with Edward, standing proudly, freely, wholly myself. Fate has strange humor. About a year after I had last seen Edward, I crossed paths with his mother in the strangest of places, a bookstore cafe in the city. She was seated at a table with two other women, speaking in low voices over porcelain cups. At first, I turned to leave, but she noticed me. "Miss Lee," she said, her crisp voice carrying decades of practiced authority. I nearly faltered, but then I steadied myself. "Yes," I replied softly, meeting her sharp eyes. She studied me for a long moment. Her pearls gleamed, her posture unyielding. Finally, she said, "My son, he still keeps that painting of yours, the woman by the river." Her words startled me. "But he returned it to me," I said without thinking. She tilted her head. "Then perhaps he had another copy made, or perhaps he could not part with his memory of it. In any case, Miss Lee, I underestimated you." The comment was curt, almost backhanded, yet for her it was an admission of sorts. She would never openly accept someone like me into their circle, but she had, in her way, acknowledged that I had marked her son's life. I smiled politely. "Your world and mine were never meant to intertwine, Mrs. Caldwell, but I hope he is content." She did not answer, and I walked away, light, free, without bitterness.
Soon, what began as companionship became something gentler, deeper. Not fireworks, not the dizzy glamour Edward had once carried with him, but warmth, steady and luminous. A fire that stayed. By now, I had achieved more than I had once dreamed. My exhibitions began attracting more attention. Galleries outside New York called, and even abroad invitations whispered of future shows. But what mattered most wasn't recognition. It was that my art was truly mine. Each painting was born not of longing to be accepted, but of joy in expression. I began to paint a series I titled Unhidden. Women dancing barefoot in city streets, women cutting pearls free from their throats, women painting their own skies. One afternoon, while sketching a new piece, I thought back to Edward, not with longing, but with profound gratitude. He had been my trial by fire, the crucible in which I discovered myself. And though I would never return to him, his part in my story would always remain, like the faint outline of an underpainting beneath a finished canvas. Years later, standing in front of one of my largest exhibitions yet, I gave a small speech. Looking out at the crowd of strangers, students, and friends, I spoke words I once couldn't have said even to myself. I once believed that to love was to prove oneself worthy of another's world. I once thought dignity meant silence in the face of cruelty. But life, in its ruthless beauty, taught me otherwise. Dignity is not silence. It is the voice that says, I will not shrink. And love is not being hidden away. Love is the light you are unafraid to walk in together. I chose dignity, and in it I found not only my art, but myself. To anyone out there struggling to decide between proving themselves or walking away, I say, walk away, proudly, if the world refuses to see you. Because the right love, the right home, will never ask you to be less. The applause that followed was thunderous, but my heart was quiet, peaceful. Edward remained a shadow in my memory. Once I read in a magazine that he had married a woman from Boston society. The photograph showed them smiling at some gala, polished, immaculately dressed. They looked appropriate. But I wondered as I looked at his eyes, if he saw her, as he once saw my painting, not for her beauty, but for her solitude. Perhaps he did. Perhaps he never learned. But that was no longer my burden. I, Ruth Ann Lee, had walked away. I had chosen my truth, and in doing so, I had discovered that the greatest wealth is not found in estates or chandeliers, but in the freedom to stand, whole, unhidden, unbroken. It has been 10 years since I last saw Edward Caldwell. I am 38 now, and my life looks nothing like the one I once imagined while staring out over the Hudson River with his ring shining faintly on my hand. I live in Brooklyn still, but in a sunlit loft now, filled with canvases and the soft rustle of music played by James, now my husband. He teaches by day and composes by night. Sometimes his melodies drift into my painting, and I like to think we are creating together, even if we are in separate rooms. We married quietly, not in a cathedral or sprawling estate, but in a small garden surrounded by friends, students, and my mother, smiling brighter than any chandelier ever could. Instead of pearls, I wore a simple silver locket she had given me when I turned 17. Inside was a tiny scrap of paper with her words, "Your courage is your crown." And she was right. The art world knows my name now. My exhibitions have traveled beyond America, Paris, Madrid, even Tokyo. Yet none of it feels like a conquest of status. It feels like sharing. Each time my paintings are unveiled in a faraway gallery, strangers approach me with tears or trembling hands, telling me that somehow my work has mirrored their own silence, their own courage. At my exhibition in Chicago, a young woman whispered to me, "I left my fiancé after reading about you. My parents thought I was foolish, but your paintings reminded me I deserved better." These moments matter more than any critical review. Because every canvas I finish now, every brushstroke carries a fragment of that girl I once was, the girl who feared she would always be hidden. And now, ironically, it is my art that refuses to be hidden.
One autumn afternoon, an unexpected letter arrived. Thick paper, embossed with gold insignia. I knew before I opened it that it came from the Caldwell estate. For a long time, I let it sit on my desk, unopened, as the sunlight shifted across it. Finally, curiosity won. It was not from Edward, but from his younger sister, Margaret, the only member of his family who had been kind to me during that dreadful dinner so many years ago. She wrote, "Ruth Ann, I do not know if this letter will ever find you in good faith, but I felt compelled. Edward passed away last month, suddenly. In his study, we found one of your paintings, The Woman at the Riverbank. He kept it all these years. I thought you deserved to know that despite the life he chose, he never truly forgot you. I hope you have found the freedom he could not." I set the letter aside, tears prickling but not breaking free. The grief I felt was not for a lover lost. That version of him had died long before.
It was grief for a man who never found the courage to step past his own gilded bars. I whispered a quiet prayer for him, and then, for the first time in over a decade, I painted the barefoot woman at the river. Only this time, she was not waiting. She was crossing. With James by my side, I founded an art foundation that funds young artists from modest backgrounds. Children who might never afford brushes or canvases are now able to create. My mother, though older and more fragile now, sometimes sits with them in the studio, helping them discover worlds inside books and paintings alike. At the foundation's inauguration, I told the gathered crowd, "The greatest tragedy is not that we are born outside of privilege. It is that we are convinced we must bend ourselves to enter it. Art has taught me that we are already whole, already worthy. We only need spaces that remind us of it." The applause was warm, but the true ovation comes each time I witness a child's eyes glow at the sight of their first completed work. Now, as I narrate this to you, I sit by the window, the autumn leaves drifting like fragile flames outside. My canvases surround me, each one marking a moment of my life. In one, a woman bends beneath a crown. In another, she throws it away. In a third, she dances on the other side of a river. I smile softly, thinking of the girl I once was, terrified of being hidden, clinging to a love that invited her to shrink. I want to reach back through time and whisper to her, "Wait, the life ahead is brighter than you dare imagine. One day you will not only walk away, you will run, arms outstretched into the light." And so my story is not of riches or titles. It is not of silken gowns or chandeliers. It is the story of a woman who chose dignity over silence, freedom over fear, and in doing so, discovered that love, the right love, asks you never to hide. I am Ruth Ann Lee, and I am unhidden.